changing pain into purpose. It sounds like a great strapline for Liberal Democrat activity on top of anything else, Steve. So welcome to us, and over to you, Lee.
I'm not going to be the first person to talk whilst on mute. So good morning, everyone. Welcome to Steve. I'll hand over to you in a moment. Thank you for being with us. Following Nuki there, gold standard of interviewing. That's a very tough act to follow. What a fantastic session we had earlier. So really pleased to have Steve with us. He's the CEO of Changes UK, their website being changesuk.org. You can have a look on there and even look to volunteer for the organisation if of interest. I'm just going to say that this is a really interesting session, a fascinating subject. I'm going to let Steve do all the talking. I'll only mention that he's got a really good story about how recovery is actually such a wider journey than we think about. It's not just about treatment. So Steve's going to talk about that, about where Changes UK came from and what they're up to. A fantastic operation. Just a few bits of housekeeping. We obviously welcome chat within the thread there, so you can put your comments on. Please do bear in mind that some of the conversations might be quite sensitive given the nature of the conversation, and of course we'll take some questions. So I'm going to let Steve have a talk for about roughly half the session, and then we'll have some questions along the way. So Steve, thank you so much for coming, but really thank you for what you and the team do. It's a fantastic thing that you offer. So the floor is yours. Please do give us your story.
Thank you, Lee. Yeah, and thanks, Laura, as well for inviting me and connecting me. It's a pleasure to be here, although I'm slightly nervous, but I feel a sense of responsibility and a sense to utilise my own story to try and help change the narrative around addiction and stigma. So, I mean, because my own views on addiction, even though I was in it, although it sounds ironic, were that it's there was something wrong with me, that I was different. And my story really that led me into addiction goes right back to my childhood and my own trauma. And I was brought up in a city, Birmingham, into a big family, very multicultural, and I suppose like my family system around like emotional intelligence or being able to kind of admit my own emotions was kind of shut down. You weren't allowed to do that in my family system. There'd be things said like, I'll give you something to cry for, and from a very early age, my dad was quite, most of his life he was quite stressed, and he was quite, he would lose his temper with me as a little kid. And I suppose his fears really then, looking back now in hindsight, were he didn't want me to end up the way that I did. So if I do something wrong, he was quite, physically, I suffered a lot of physical abuse really, as a kid. And I spent a lot of my childhood quite scared. And, I went to school, and I was always in trouble. Now, I don't know if I got ADHD or there's lots of labels now, but I was always branded as the naughty kid. I was always in trouble. Like, even though I wanted to do well at school because I didn't want to get the punishment when I got home, I was fully intent on doing well and behaving myself. And within 30 minutes or so, I was doing the same again. I was messing about again. I was in trouble again. I knew I was going to be in trouble at home. So I spent most of my childhood, to be honest, quite scared. And found a way out of that really quite early. I abandoned myself, who I really was, in my emotional state, because it wasn't safe to be weak and to be vulnerable. And sometimes when my dad, say if he'd had a drink or something bad had happened, he would hit me and wouldn't stop until I stopped crying. So when I was silent and still, eventually it would stop. So it kind of made me feel like that strategy worked. Do you know what I mean? So it wasn't safe to be crying. It wasn't safe to be emotional. It wasn't safe to ask to say stop. You just had to kind of take it. Do you know what I mean? And then it would stop. And I suppose like I share these stories not because I blame my dad. Like, I love my dad. He ain't with us anymore, and he was a really good dad, but he just didn't have he didn't understand the impact that would have on me as a kid. He wanted me to be better. than him. Do you know what I mean? And he thought he was taught that from his dad. So, you know, the whole family system was at play. The other thing, and I always felt like a real disappointment to him. Do you know what I mean? It was my fault. He was always angry, and it was like, you know, like I'm in the way. And the truth, it goes way back to like even when I was born. You know, they got together. You know, they had an affair, and then my mum got pregnant with me, so they left their partners and come together and had me. So that kind of like the shame. Do you know what I mean? Like I've always felt like I was a mistake. Like I'm in the way. I shouldn't be here. And then I was about 9 years old. We moved out to Rubery, and like a fresh start. And I was sexually abused when I was about 9 or 10. And I didn't tell anyone that. To be honest, I didn't tell my parents because I thought that I'd be in trouble again. Do you know what I mean? I thought they wouldn't believe me, or it was my fault that I was dirty, that happened to me. So I kept that a secret for years, and I suppose that I always kind of believed that I was dirty myself. So like when I look now at my childhood, and I think like I've done a lot of trauma work now, so I'm kind of like my story doesn't define me. You know, like it doesn't mean anything about me, but I have an understanding about the beliefs that I had about myself, which led me into addiction. So the first time, you know, when I got to like 15, and I started drinking alcohol at parties or, you know, at home. You know, all those fears, all those insecurities, all those beliefs about myself, you know, like that everybody else is better than me and got it together more than me, they just went away. I felt invincible. You know, I'll be drinking alcohol, I just thought, just like, I am free. I am good enough. You know, in fact, I didn't feel just good enough. I felt better than other people, you know, and I mean, I didn't have like a committee meeting in my own head and say like, I'm going to do this for the rest of my life. But the reality is that's what happened. I felt that level of freedom, and I didn't want to go back to feeling like this. And then I found myself around a group of people hanging around on the streets, getting into gangs and stuff where they all felt the same, and we would all get drunk together, and we'd all use drugs together. And it was about camaraderie. It was about a sense of belonging, being part of a tribe, being valued, you know, being enough. And I learned, and I put lots of masks on, that, you know, that I was tough and I didn't have feelings and I didn't have emotions, and, you know, because in that world as well, if you have emotions, you're vulnerable to being a target for being bullied. Do you know what I mean? And so I learned quite early on how to be tough and how to appear. Well, I'd sort of appear tougher than I was, really, was the reality. But to be able to do that, I needed to be using all the time, you know, like, and it was different drugs. It was like a progression. Then it was like, you know, there was always something. As long as I didn't do that, I would be okay. As long as we're just doing this and we're not doing that. And the thing with addiction is that as long as you've got someone you can look down on, you can justify and rationalise anything you're doing. Do you know what I mean? Like, I didn't end up like actually homeless on the street. I ended up homeless. But if I had have ended up homeless, I would have had a Marks and Spencer's cardboard box underneath me. You know, looking down on the people with the Audi box. In fact, Audi's not too bad these days. But you know, like that's how I would have thought. It was in my own mind, and, you know, I'd always be moving the goalposts and thinking, oh no, you know. And in the beginning, you know, like when I was younger and I was like 17, 18, I've always been entrepreneurial, and, you know, and I got into like drug dealing. And thinking, you know, that just for my own habit, so that I didn't have to commit crime, thinking that wasn't a crime, you know, and I justify this stuff that I can, you know, and I'm buying and selling stuff. But also, my dad was alive then, so it was important for me to appear from the outside that I was doing well. All I ever wanted was for him to say, I'm proud of you. That's all I ever wanted. I didn't have it in me to say that. He never had it in him to say that to me. Do you know what I mean? So there would be a part of my life that I'd be showing to the world of, like, you know, I was buying and selling cars. I was an apprentice plumber. I was doing well in that way, you know, and that was more for him, really. And then I was living in the other world where I felt where I belonged, because in the what I would call as the normal world, then I was back to feeling like I'm not enough, like I'm a fraud. And then, you know, so I'd have me feet in two camps. I'd abandoned who I was. Like, I had no sense of identity. I didn't know, you know, I was in and out of the criminal justice system. I was in and out of homelessness. I always had like hope early on. I always thought there's something better for me. And like, you know, the cycle of addiction just got worse and worse and worse. And like, I didn't know this at the time, but the reality was I just needed to escape my own pain. And the drugs that I was using wasn't doing it after a period of time. So then I'd get into a different crowd and I'd start using something else. And in the end, I was using heroin and crack and alcohol and benzos and not anything. There wasn't anything that I wouldn't use on a daily basis to just escape my own pain. You know, like the early days when we used, you know, I was going to the rave scenes and I was taking ecstasy and it was all a party, you know, it was all like togetherness, all of us together, you know, no matter where you were from, we were all equal, we all loved each other because I'm wired for love and connection. Like I'm quite a sensitive soul. Like I need that in my life. And I'm not ashamed to say that now. Like I've got that in my life. But when I took ease and went to raves, I found that. But one day everyone stopped laughing, everyone stopped dancing. And I carried on looking for the party. I carried on looking to escape my own reality. So I ended up in this lifestyle of like dog eat dog, you know, living at animal level addiction. I always wanted to stop. I was always doing my own detoxes. I was always swapping one drug for another. I always thought if I stop taking heroin, I go back to the pubs and I'm drinking and having cocaine, that's socially better. Do you know what I mean? And I'd end up getting arrested. And like I never considered ever, and I'm not daft, but I never considered to stop taking drugs. I need to stop taking drugs, meaning all drugs, you know, like I never even contemplated that idea. It was always someone else's fault. I was never able to take accountability. I was self-centered and selfish to the core. It's what the world did to me. You know, I was a victim. And while I was thinking like that, I was always like, I was never going to change. And it got to the end where, you know, my daughter was born, and because that was one of the things, like I wanted to die then, and then she was pregnant with my daughter, and I thought I've got something to live for now. This time I'm going to do it. And when she was born, and I remember holding her because she nearly died. I remember holding her in my arms and just crying and just saying, I'm never going to use again. This is it. Like I've never had that feeling of love before, unconditional love. And within 15 minutes, I was using again. Like I just couldn't help myself. You know, I'd want to stop and I just couldn't. And I just thought I'm going to be a liability for her. And I planned to take my own life, and I was suicidal. And I was in a flat for 3 days with a gun, wanting to shoot myself. And I'd write a note for her to open when she was 16. And I was just sobbing for 3 days, and I just didn't have the courage really to go through with it. That's what happened. And I ended up getting a phone call from a kid from my estate who had gone into prison, because that's the only time then you would get help for addiction, is if you went to prison, you would get help to go to a rehab then. But because I wasn't in prison, I wasn't getting no help. And to be honest, before then, I was never ready. I was always a man with a plan. I didn't need no help, because help is dangerous. If you're reaching out to someone to help you, like I didn't trust anyone. I didn't allow anyone in close to me. But he found me at that point of desperation where I had no hope. I was open for anything, and he told me about this hostel in Weston-super-Mare. And I went down there in the shop, and I was down there, and that was on the 4th of the 4th, 2004, and I haven't used since that day. And I tell you what's happened, the difference with that day is that I found a community of people that felt like me, who thought like me, who'd been through similar experiences as me, so I didn't feel alone. Like I didn't want to use, I didn't want to be a burden on society. I wanted to be an asset to the community. I've always had this sense of like, I know I'm good, you know, I know there's a part of me that's good, but I'd lost that, I'd abandoned that over the years and felt that I was bad. And I learned about addiction. I started going to 12-step meetings. I started getting into mutual aid, being part of a wider community. And I started learning that I'm not a bad person getting better. I'm a sick person getting well. No, like I didn't choose to live like that. All the shame. See, when you take the drugs and the alcohol away from me, you start pulling the scab off the wound. There's a reason that I used. There's a reason that I treated myself that way. There's a reason that I wanted to escape my own reality and hide from life. When you take the drugs and the alcohol away, there's the reason. It's there. So I was riddled with shame. I was riddled with guilt. I was riddled with all these beliefs about not being good enough, being useless, being dirty, you know, not unlovable, unwanted. You know, I was walking every day, living this stuff again, back to being like 12, 13 years old. I needed that support around me, and I found it. You know, I'm really grateful for the people that were in recovery that put their arms around me and said, me too, like, I understand, you can do this, Steve. Not people that loved me and wanted me to do it, who didn't understand, who thought they had an idea of what I should do with some kind of level of judgment in their own innocence, but people who had been there and walked that journey with me. So I was excited, like I'd wanted this for years, like years and years and years. So I was going to meetings, I was participating. I soon found out I'm quite useful. You know, like, I mean, I remember someone saying to me that I'm like a laxative. I make shit happen, and like, he did mean it actually as a compliment. Do you know what I mean? Like, because when I get my mind onto something, I can, you know, I'm good at kind of bringing people in and project management, stuff like that. So quite early on, I got involved down there and putting events on and just, you know, going into prisons and carrying the message and letting people know there's hope for when they come out, and linking people into housing. And then, and I'm cutting short on time, but then when I came home to Birmingham, like, I'd had two kids then. One, Bunny, who was born just before I got clean, and then I had another one, and they were living in Birmingham. And when I came home, I thought, well, I'm going to integrate into this community in Birmingham. There was no community in Birmingham. There was like the meetings I went to, there was only one meeting a week with 6 people. So it was like a needle in a haystack. But it just happened that there was a few people, because then they would fund people to go to rehab if they'd been in prison, but people wouldn't come home. So you know, so if they did come home, they'd usually relapse. But anyway, it just happened there was a few people we connected with all moved back. We all got excited, got involved in kind of service and developing the recovery community and going into prisons and doing, you know, like presentations to GPs and to probation and to the police and stuff about addiction and about recovery to get people signposts. And then I was a plumber at the time. I was running around all over the country and like employing people who were in recovery as well and training them. And then I got a house that was kind of inherited to my mum, and my mum had my brother in it who was using, so it ended up like a crack house, and there's a lot of police activity. So she wanted him out, and I just thought, I want to get this house for people who can move in there and get the right level of support. And that's how Changes was born. It was never meant to be what it is today. It was just something I wanted to do to give back. I wanted to just create a service that I wish was there for me. You know, if I could have come home, or when I lived in Birmingham, had somewhere where I could live that was safe with other people that are in recovery, have someone kind of supporting us, getting us into volunteering and training, like looking at what are my goals, what are my hopes and my dreams, someone believing me and helping me and guiding me, because I didn't have those living skills. So that's what we did. We had volunteers, we linked in with local colleges, we linked in with the voluntary sector, got people moving towards their dreams and education and into university, and worked with social services, people getting their kids back. And it was like magic. It was absolutely magic. It was like within 2 years, we didn't have a single relapse, and we'd had 2 houses by then. And then we needed funding, because we didn't, you know, we was losing money. The plumbing business was kind of like propping it up. Someone went into liquidation owing me loads of money with the plumbing business and completely wiped me out. And then I realised that we need this funded. So we was advised, we set up Constitution as a community interest company, which is a non-for-profit organisation. And it's just grown from there, really. You know, over the last 12 years, it's gone from, you know, just a couple of houses into, we do lots of stuff. We're just opening the detox in 3 weeks. We've got a rehab, we've got a residential rehab, we've got lots of properties all over Birmingham, all over Solihull. We go into HMP Birmingham, we deliver groups in there and get people into recovery. We do lots of work with the corporate sector as well. We do training on employment law around supporting people in the corporate world, because, you know, as we've evolved, we've identified lots of gaps where support is required, and we've learned a lot. And you know, like what I have learned, one of the statistics I was talking to someone last night about is, if you had all the people locally who are in addiction, had them all together, and 75% of those people who are in addiction, struggling with addiction, are in full-time employment. 75% of those people. Now, like even me in recovery, I would always think that people in addiction are the people who are living on the street, in and out of the, you know, the homelessness, in and out of hostels, in and out of prison. Actually, 75% of the people who are suffering with addiction are in full-time employment. Now, a lot of them end up on the street because of the lack of support that's there. So we've been working with corporates because we want to campaign and lobby to change where, like in employment law, in the corporate sector, that now we've had the drive towards with mental health, which has been really good, so that people suffering with anxiety or depression can raise their hand and say they need help and they need support, which is brilliant. But so that now lives in health and well-being. Well, addiction doesn't live in health and well-being. Addiction lives in disciplinary, because it's still seen as a lifestyle choice. You know, you know, it's still seen as a criminal issue. You know, if people are sick, like the solution is to lock those people up, rather than having some compassion and giving them support and helping them, because that's what we do. And we have a 78% success rate of anyone that comes into changes that not only stay clean, that they move on in their lives, they get their kids back, they're not a burden on the community, they're giving back, they're being, you know, of purpose, of value within our communities. So we utilise those bank of people to share their stories, to change the narrative. And what I'd love to see one day is that it's changed. You know, the policy at national level within employment law, we're working with ACAS to try and change that, so it's recognised as an illness. You know, so that people who are in the corporate sector can raise their hands and go and say, I'm dying here, I'm suffering with addiction, I can't stop using, I really need support. Now, we're not advocating for people to be drinking and using while they're on the job, because there needs to be processes in place to make sure it's safe and secure. But what we want to do is put the structures in to support people so that they can raise their hand, like they can be, you know, if they've got diabetes or they've got anxiety or they've got depression, they can raise their hand. Because I know people who've worked in like high-level exec jobs who have been using for years, trying to manage it all and lying to everybody and putting masks on and trying to like pretend to the world that they're fine when they're dying inside, and then they've ended up getting caught, ended up losing their job, and you know, one in particular who works at the bank, he carried on going to work. He carried on dressing up in his suit every morning and pretending to go to work for over a month because of the shame that he couldn't tell his own family that he'd been sacked for drinking. We want to support these people so that doesn't happen. So it's evolved changes, and I suppose with austerity, like there isn't a lot of funding. There's funding available for drug and alcohol treatments to keep people, you know, safe. But there's not a lot of funding for recovery. Like, we're always fighting and writing bids to get money in to support us. We've gone and developing the organisation so that we're able to offer people treatment, particularly for people that haven't got the money, because there's lots of private clinics that have set up over the last few years that charge a lot of money for detox and rehab, because there's not money available within the local authorities to send people to detox and rehab. So people are capitalising on that and charging a lot of money. I'm fighting to be able to still continue to offer free beds for people. They're not just haven't got the money, but there's people that are not even in the system. The system has let them down. You know, we want to advocate for those people to make sure that you know, the right support is available for everyone, regardless of their financial situation. So we're just opening up this new detox that a third of the beds are funded privately, the other third are funded by local authorities across the UK that have little bits of funding, and then the other third is free. They're for the people that haven't got the money to do that. And from that, you know, also we've got social enterprises. So over the years, we've created social enterprises that are run by people in recovery to offer services, you know, and products to the community. There's two things with that. One, it offers a place of community, a sense of belonging for people who are isolated in the community, but it offers a sense of purpose for people who are in recovery as well. You know, in Solihull, we've got a coffee shop, we've got a children's shop, we've just opened an adult clothing shop. as well. We've got a gardening business. We've got an IT company. We've got Recovery Central as well, which does like conferencing and banqueting as well. So we've got lots of social enterprise, and we want to grow that. So they're businesses. Then we're not well-meaning amateurs. They're businesses in their own right that develop profits, offer opportunities for people to come in and volunteer, get into employment, but also all the profits get reinvested back into the community, and not into the community where the government feel it should go. Like, we're on the ground, so we know where the gaps are. We're talking to people. We understand, you know, and we can plug those gaps. And that's the idea while we're driving forward, so that we can generate the money locally and plug the gaps so that everyone has got the right support that they need. So it's been a journey. Like, Changes was never meant to be what it is. And, you know, I suppose in a sense that I'm kind of grateful for everything that I went through, so that I have got a purpose. You know, I've got a responsibility to share my story and show the way for a lot of people who are suffering in silence, so that they can get the help they need to live the life that they deserve as well. Because, you know, like, you know, we're all born into the world innocent, and the things that happen along the way that change the way that we see the world, that change the way that we see ourselves. And with the right level of support, people can get back on track to where they were going in the beginning. And that's what we need to do. So I don't want to, I know I've got about 3 minutes left, but I feel I've kind of come to the end. So I think Lee's going to open it up for questions and answers.
Sure. Well, Steve, thank you so much for sharing all of that, some really personal details, and that often is a big help, isn't it? Because when you're talking to different audiences, people will hear things, well, I recognize that, and that's something I identify with, which can allow them to get more confidence to ask for help and reach out and so on. So thank you very much for sharing your story, and what a fantastic situation you're now in with Changes, and how it's grown bigger than even you thought was possible initially. So that's fantastic. We've got some questions coming in. Please do drop the questions in, and there's two we've got to start with, really following from what you were talking about. So we've had a question from Neil, and he references your compulsion to be part of a community that you talked about earlier on, and Neil's asking you, Steve, how do we enable the development of self-support groups? So kind of like your journey, do you think there are opportunities that other people could build organizations like Changes? Is it difficult? How do you view that?
Yeah, about creating, I think that, and like everything I say, like I haven't got the answers for everything, but these are only my views, is that I think that over the years, and in particular with COVID, but even prior to that, with like the use of social media and digital media, how people communicate, is that I think generally communities have lost that sense of belonging. And I know that where we've got the 3 shops on the Linden Ward in Solihull, is that a lot of our customers, some of them, when we opened the first shop there, which was the charity shop, some of them used to come to that shop every day just to have someone to speak to. And I think we've lost that, you know, like over the years. And I think that peer groups I suppose it's about encouraging and creating a space where people can come and share their own experience, so that people don't feel alone. You know, because although each experience is unique, there's definitely someone else who's struggling in that way. And I think I can only speak with my own family and the culture that I grew up in, is that we'd harboured and protected this kind of way of life that people don't share their feelings. And, you know, I'm doing lots of work with the youth now as well to try and change the narrative around that, to embrace their vulnerability, to be able to be emotionally responsible and emotionally accountable, so that they can be who they really are. So I think it's just creating, and that's what we're trying to do there. I think there needs to be some investment into that. And I know money isn't the answer, but I suppose, you know, even creating a space where communities can come and use that, you know, to plug the needs for people. Because connection, I mean, for addiction anyway, connection is the antidote to addiction. But not just addiction, like everyone's wired for connection. People need that. There's a lot of people isolated in our communities that need that, and then, you know, struggle with mental health, end up at the GP. That's the only place I can go. I'm just trying to turn this timer off.
I think your eggs are boiled.
Yeah, I've just downloaded this app so I can go over time.
That's good. Yeah, good. Thank you for that, Stephen. Thank you for the question, Neil. Kind of a follow-on in a way. We've got a question here from Nuki. In fact, I've got two questions. I'll go to Nuki's first one. A special shout out to Laura as well, who's helping me in the chat here. And of course, you know Laura well, and Laura actually referred you to us in the first place. So thank you very much, Laura. So first question from Nuki is, thank you so much for telling your story. Very insightful, and we can certainly tell how passionate you are on the subject. So Nuki's question then is, what would you say is one of the biggest misconceptions that exist about people who are suffering from addiction? What sort of social attitudes are there?
Yeah, well, I mean, like most people, the majority of people, and I can say this now because it is past and that person isn't in post anymore, but even the Drug and Alcohol Commissioner in Birmingham at one time referenced drug addicts is like, well, they choose to live like that. It's just insane. It's so archaic that the views are that people who are on the streets or suffering with addiction, it's a lifestyle choice, that they're bad people. You know, we need to lock these people up. And there's a history around that. Even in America, years ago, they nearly lobbied and changed policy around that to bring it into mental health or to bring it into health and well-being. And then I think Reagan came into post and then, you know, declared the war on drugs. Let's lock them all up. And you know, like, the reality is, it is never, ever works. It's never worked. It's never been proven to work because it's the wrong intervention. Like, locking people away because they're sick and need support isn't going. All it does is harbour people together who are resentful against the system, and then come out and then they feel the same again when they come out. And then what happens is people then become institutionalised and they feel safer in prison because they're not able to cope emotionally with responsibilities. They feel a burden on community. So, you know, like, criminalising addiction is just insane. You know, like, I know Einstein says insanity, the definition of insanity is repeating the same mistakes, expecting a different result. Now, we've been doing this for years, is criminalising addiction, where, you know, we know that if you give people the right support, the majority of people in addiction want help, need help.
Absolutely, absolutely. And there's a good follow-on from that. We've got a question from Barry, and I was going to touch on this as well. So Barry, good timing there. So Barry's question is, what are your views on decriminalisation? So we're talking obviously here particularly about drugs that are currently illegal. To sort of expand that, so perhaps useful for the audience. So you've got two kind of key positions, haven't we, in the world of drug law reform. Decriminalisation means that users, people who are using drugs, it wouldn't be illegal to use them. Therefore, they could get extra support and it wouldn't be such a stigma. We currently have in the Lib Dems a policy on cannabis to legalise, which is a different thing, where you bring the supply and production of drugs into cannabis, specifically on our policy, into a legal position, so people could buy it and use it legally. And the big benefit there as well is you take the money out of the hands of the criminal gangs and all the violence that ensues. So Barry's question, what are your views on decriminalisation? Do you support that or legalise it? How do you find that area?
So I think I support it but only if the right interventions are put into place. I think just making it legal isn't the answer. In a sense of that, you know, like, I refer to addiction, and I know we spoke about this before, Lee, is that there's too many people, even government campaigns that are drug specific, you know, around, there's an issue now with alcohol related deaths or heroin related deaths or spice or crack cocaine or whatever. Like, we need to be talking about addiction, because, like, addiction is a manifestation. Like, whatever you use, like, people use sex or shopping or gambling or there's lots of, you know, addiction is the issue. People need support. So I think there's an opportunity with decriminalising drugs so that we can get people in and have a conversation. So they can't just come and just, you know, like, be prescribed drugs, that they have to come and have a consultation. And I think if we're working with the recovery community with that, rather than professionals, just professionals, and I don't mean people in recovery are not professionals as well, because there's a lot that are, but with people with lived experience that can be part of that intervention. So it's someone's coming in to be prescribed drugs, that they have an intervention. Maybe they'll get a peer support worker with them, working with them, helping them integrate into the recovery community, look at what their needs are emotionally, as well as, you know, looking at housing and their family system. I think it's an opportunity really, because there's a lot of people out there who are not talking to anybody. There's no intervention happening. They're just in and out of the criminal justice system, and they're using, and like you say, all the money is you know, like fueling a lot of gang activity as well. So that you know, that the money can be invested into helping people out of addiction, because I think most people in addiction don't want to be living that way. They know that they deserve better.
Absolutely. We could spend a whole day on that topic, couldn't we? And for those who are interested in that, watch this space later this year. One thing actually you did mention, there's another question here from Newkey, is how you talked about your experiences in childhood pretty much led you down the path that you went down. So Newkey's question on what types of interventions do you think might have been useful for you at a younger age, when you were having those problems, before you had your addiction issues, and perhaps at the start of the addiction, what kind of intervention should we bring in at a sort of, I suppose, especially at younger ages?
So you know, if I was to see a young boy, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, look, you know, that age, who's always in and out of trouble, who's always angry, you know, who's unable to kind of get close to anyone, right? The question I would ask is, are you okay? Like, tell me about your sadness. Like, no, even the school, I mean, I was suspended, I was expelled from lots of schools. My dad even put me in a private school in the end. I don't know whether there's some government scheme that supported them to do that. And even in that there, like, no one ever asked me if I was okay. And I do, when I say that, feel a level of sadness. Like, I'm not that boy anymore. Like, but I've you know, come from that. Because the truth was, I wasn't. Like, you know, I was always punished for my behaviour. And I suppose that, you know, like, and that's what we want to do now. And that's what why we're working with local schools and local colleges, so that we can go in to make sure that we address their behaviours and see, you know, like, the trauma-informed approach is not about seeing, like, what's wrong with you. It's about seeing what's happened to you. Everyone's got a reason for their behaviour. Everybody, they're displaying something, they're trying to express something in a way that they know how. So it's about identifying that and having teachers or people that are engaged with youth understanding, you know, and being trained in a trauma-informed approach.
Absolutely. I think it very much, of course, overlaps with the world of sort of mental health, stigma and so on. And one of the questions I'm often asked talking about that area is, well, you know, what one thing could you do to get us to be better with mental health and those sorts of discussions? And pretty much kind of what you're saying there really is, if you ask somebody, how are they, pay attention to the answer and actually really mean the question. And it makes such a big difference, doesn't it? Like you say. Bob's got a question here where he's referring to when you talked about 75% of people with addictions are in work, and you identify that, of course, we need them to be able to speak out more and get support. So Bob's asking, he's given some examples of other types of addictions. So to expand on Bob's question, but also to ask directly, he says, do you think many of us will suffer from addictions? That helps us to identify those others with addictions. And I suppose coupled with that is, can you talk a little bit about the different types of addiction? Because often drugs, and of course alcohol is legal, but one of the worst. Drugs often get the big news, but there's different types of gambling. You mentioned is horrific. What other types of addiction are there, and does that help us to identify with other people?
Well, you think, you know, like, people, and you know, I always think of, like, the executives or people that have got a lot of responsibility, like high-level targets in sales or whatever it is. Like, you know, they're under a lot of pressure now. Like, unless they're emotionally responsible or emotionally intelligent and got a good support structure around them, you know, whether it's at home or it's with their colleagues, and they can share that and how they're feeling and how they're, you know, how they're coping with that, they're going to find a way of coping with that level of stress. And I don't just mean high-level executives. It comes all the way to anybody who's got a level of responsibility and a burden upon them to be able to deliver or perform. So it's about Like, and you see, you know, like, it does manifest in lots of different ways. It isn't just about drug addiction or smoking crack in the toilet or having a little, you know, like bottles of whiskey where they're having a swig or vodka and stuff like that. You know, it manifests in lots of ways. Food is one of them. You know, you see a lot of people who use food to escape their own reality. Do you know what I mean? It's kind of like zoning out and just like looking forward to something to you know, like because it's like when you're in the pursuit of something, you're not in the now. When I get this thing, whatever it is, you know, then I'm going to feel okay. And the reality is when they get it, then they're still left with how they feel. So they need more because it's their only what they see as their only escape, which is exactly like drug addiction, exactly like alcohol addiction. You know, like you said, gambling is another one. Always on that chase. I'm just doing this, and then I'll come back to that. You know, it's people are just navigating their own ways to deal with the stress and the pressure that they're under. You know, they're not bad. It's just, this is what happens. And, you know, in the corporate world, it's seen as okay, you know, like to just leave and go to the pub or, you know, like talk about how much you've been drinking. But as soon as you mention drugs, there's so much stigma around that you know, like that, then, you know, you're not part of. So yeah, there's lots of different ways that people use, and you know, and we've had so many stories of people that have come to us that come from the corporate sector and use lots of things, and then people end up in drug addiction and then get clean, and then, you know, if they're not addressing their own trauma, they're still as vulnerable to using anything else, you know, into gambling or sex or shopping or anything, you know, make it a consumer. I can ruin my life quite easily without the use of drugs if I'm not, you know, working on myself.
Thank you, Steve. We've got one more question from the audience from Rebecca. I've got one question which is really Lib Dem, and so any of you campaigners out there, you might want to listen to this answer shortly. But the question first from Rebecca. We are unfortunately drawing close to time. I think you can all see that every workplace, university, everywhere needs to get Steve in for a talk. So if you go to changesuk.org, you can see more about the organisation. So Rebecca's question, I'm going to read the text here, that your story, Steve, is very inspirational. So Rebecca used to teach at Her Majesty's Prison in Birmingham, and one of the most obvious issues was that men suffer from low self-esteem as a result of life experiences in their childhood. I, as in Rebecca, literally had men crying because they never had been told they were good at anything else before. Would you look to expand your support to teenagers or advise councils on how to support mental health and emotional well-being to prevent them from self-medicating, such as with drugs, including alcohol in the future? And do you feel that more funding needs to be provided to family support services?
Absolutely. You know, like, honestly, even hearing that question is like a breath of fresh air. Like yes, personally, I'm passionate. I'm really interested in evolving our service and not to just be a bigger service, but to utilise our skills and experience in the best way we can to have an impact on our communities. And I don't mean just me personally, I mean the people that have come through as well. I've got lots of different experiences where we can provide support. And like, you know, what you said there about working in prison and understanding, you know, that like there's, you know, men crying because they've never been told that they were good at anything before. It's like, we need to change that narrative. We need to get to kids before they end up in the criminal justice system. We need to remind them that whatever's happened to them wasn't their fault, that they are good enough, they do deserve to be loved. You know, that's what needs to happen. So there needs to be funding to be able to enable us to get into schools and to get into the, you know, wherever kids are, schools, colleges, university, to start changing that so that we can make the intervention before, rather than, you know, putting a plaster on the wound.
Absolutely.
We need to be looking at the wound and asking, you know, what's happened to them.
Absolutely. So I'm going to thank you for all of that. So I'm going to finish with a very Lib Demi question, but it's very much related. There are lots of campaigns across this country, including some right here in Birmingham, around HMOs, as they're called, houses of multiple occupancy, exempt housing. There's lots of different phrases. Now, often they're seen in some campaign groups locally as, well, let's get rid of them because they cause antisocial behaviour, they drive up crime and so on. There is another argument that says, well, actually, it's down to the fact that they're poorly run and not maintained well by the landlords. Where do you sit on that? And what do you think our message should be to local communities who have problems with exempt housing?
Yeah, definitely the latter. It's not about kind of closing them down, because the reality is there's a lack of housing. You know, people need housing. You know, they need a roof over their head and they need a safe place to live. But what has happened, particularly in Birmingham over the last few years, is there's been lots of rogue landlords that have set up and capitalised on the exempt accommodation, and you know, and not even setting up as a non-for-profit organisation or anything, setting up as limited companies, and then they get RSLs, they link in with RSLs who claim the benefits for them, so they don't even have to register with the local authority. So they fill up the beds. They say they're providing the support, and I'm not saying all, but this is, you know, what we hear on the ground, and lots of people who come through these, you know, HMOs end up with us, and the level of support is like it's sparse. Like, you know, there's no support for them, and they end up like, a lot of them like crack houses. There's a lot of violence in there. There's a lot of criminal activity, a lot of prostitution. You know, it's just, yeah, it's not good. It's not safe. It's not what it's not what we need. With it, they need to be regulated, and we are working with the BBSC. Hopefully, we're going to get the gold standard. I was hoping we was going to get last week, but we're setting up. We're part of. We're working with those to make sure that we're putting structures in place so that exempt accommodation work to a certain standard, and people have, you know, involved in the Charter of Rights and stuff, so that we can make, you know, make a difference. So that, because they're getting paid a lot of money, they're getting paid a lot more money than they would from local housing allowance to provide that support. So they should be doing that rather than, you know, making profits.
Absolutely. And I saw earlier there was a snapshot of Joe and Ian's leaflet in Harborne in Birmingham, and one of their campaign items is to call to reform the law, because the law's very loose in areas, isn't it? And it does allow for rogue landlords and so on. But as you say, the focus should be on the people that need the housing, and we need to definitely change the law to get that right. So we're just about bang on time. I'm going to hand back to Richard Dixon in a moment. So thank you to everybody that's commented in the chat. Clearly some things we need to pick up, and certainly I think we need to help promote and share. So changesuk.org is the website. Steve, thank you so much for coming on today. It's been a really interesting and quite hard-hitting, but in a good way, session to really talk about the issues. I'm going to give you a minute to say something in closing. Thank you again for coming on, and yeah, 60 seconds to finish up for us, please.
I wasn't expecting that, so well, no, I seriously want to say thank you for bringing me on here. It's always a pleasure. You know, I still have a bit of imposter syndrome from where I come from, to think, you know, what am I doing here? But I'm really grateful for the opportunity, and for you for believing in me, believing what I do as well. And I suppose, you know, together, you know, we can make a difference. You know, I don't want to work on my own. I need the support of, you know, local councillors and, you know, anyone, the sector, to be able to continue the work that we do. So it's been a pleasure being here, and thank you, and particularly give a shout out to Laura. She's amazing on our ward. The work that she does is what I think all politicians should do.
Fantastic. Thank you again, Stephen. Thank you to you and your team for everything that you do. Thank you very much for coming on.
Thanks, Lee.
Thank you, and back to you, Richard.
Well, thank you, Lee, for hosting that, and thank you, Steve, for joining us today.